Welcome to Mintel's Little Conversation, real conversations with actionable insights into what consumers want and why. I'm your host, Andrew Davidson, based in New York. Mintel has just published its latest global outlook on sustainability. And in today's episode, I'm delighted to welcome back Richard Cope, the author of the report, for our annual check-in on how consumer sentiment and behaviours are changing when it comes to this important topic. Richard is an expert in macro trends and consumer behaviour, specialising in sustainability. He describes himself as a futurologist and is an in-demand speaker and has been a guest on this podcast many times. Welcome back, Richard.
Thank you for having me again, Andrew. How are you?
Great to see you. Great to see you. Where does the pod find you today?
I'm at home in my garden shed office in Winchester in the south of England.
Excellent. I mean, I know Winchester is a beautiful place. This is a global audience. So what's Winchester famous for?
I guess it's most famous for it was actually the capital of England under the Normans, but we're going back to the sort of 11th century for that. So yeah, we've ceded power to London since then, but yeah, it's still a great place.
Do your plug for the Winchester Tourism Board. Well, I enjoy our annual check-ins. Last year, you ended the podcast saying that you were optimistic about the year ahead. How would you summarize this year in terms of sustainability? And, did your optimism, play out or come to fruition?
Well, to use a weather analogy, I guess it's been mixed. I mean, there are good things which have come out of the research we've done. I think, people's belief in climate change is coming over is pretty strong. We're seeing more and more consumers getting engaged around this issue. We're seeing activism play a role there. And we're seeing some modest progress in people's dietary behavior, graduating to more sustainable diets, and some quite positive growth in things like people using renewable energy or people transitioning to electric vehicles and things like that. On the bad side, and I know we'll get into this a bit more depth, but there's definitely this externalization of responsibility. It's always someone else's problem. By that, I mean another country's problem in terms of who's perceived to be causing this. And probably the biggest thing, we're seeing some challenges, I think, in terms of there's a bit of a crisis of confidence amongst people that whether they can have a positive impact, whether we're running out of time. So that's coming through as well.
That's interesting. I mean, I do recall when we chatted last year and we began our conversation, talking about the air quality index, and it was shortly after New York City had been bathed in smoke from the those historic Canada wildfires. Last year we were talking about water shortages. This year, major flooding events have dominated the headlines, from Dubai to Brazil, and every year is the warmest on record, it seems. As we've discussed before, attitudes are very much shaped by what's tangible, what you see at the local level, what you see, what you read, what you hear. As consumers, how can we make sense of what's happening?
Well, tangibility is key. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the strong things we're seeing in the research is that people do agree that their country is suffering from climate change. More and more people are telling us that. And I think this is an issue which is touching people. They're being engaged because this is an existential threat. They're starting to perceive it as a threat to their finances, their own personal resources, as well as seeing it as a sort of public health crisis as well. So all those things are concerning people and engaging them. So they're reacting in a way that they want to protect themselves and their families. They obviously want to protect their own resources. And it's those kind of issues that come through very strongly when we look at what people's top behaviors are, or when we look at what people's top concerns are. They're very concerned still about water shortages, you mentioned, but also about food shortages, and very concerned about things like air quality. So yeah, it's very much seen as a financial threat and a health threat to people, I think.
Yeah, and it's a great report, and one of the key points that really comes out, of course, is that, like you say, it's about consumers, and that consumers are both the problem in that they are the creators of emissions, but also they're the solution, and that they can change their behavior. And I thought what was fascinating is that there is by no means a consensus on the question of whether human activity does impact climate change, regardless of where you are in the world. I mean, while climate denial might, yes, like you say, it might be in the minority, there still seems to be a lot of skepticism, a lot of indifference from a global perspective. How do people feel about this issue in different parts of the world?
Yeah, well, on average, I think it's around a quarter of consumers do agree with this statement that, climate change is not something linked to humans, and we're not causing it. In some markets, you do get a majority of people taking that view, namely India and namely the United States as well. Elsewhere, it's always a minority of consumers who take that view, and in all those other markets, there are, if not a clear majority of consumers, probably sort of anything from like 40 to upper 30% of people disagree with that statement and do think this is a human issue. And there's a little caveat before we get onto the market. There's a caveat I'll make there. In the research, just because someone doesn't believe in human-induced climate change, they still might take that position but be concerned about forest conservation or concerned about workers' rights. So that doesn't remove them from being part of the sustainable debate.
So just digging a bit further then, you mentioned India and you mentioned the United States. So if we sort of do a sort of little tour of the world then, so if you think about like the Western Hemisphere, the Americas, how do people feel there?
Well, yeah, it does vary. I mean, there are Brazil, people there are very activated on this issue. They really feel that, they believe in the issue. They feel like they're being impacted by it. China feels very engaged about it as well. That's the strongest response of all. I think 60% of our sample disagreed with that statement that, it's not linked to human activity. Country like the United States, it's obviously, we know that's one of the many countries where it's been weaponized as a political issue, and it's obviously extremely divided there. Western Europe, broadly, similar levels, around sort of, less than a fifth of people, are climate deniers as well. So to be honest, outside of India and the United States is pretty much a sort of shift between around sort of 40% people disagree with that, and it's only about a fifth of people who do, fall into the denier camp.
Why do you think there's sort of differences exist?
I think sometimes in larger countries, when we ask this question, which might be the case in India, might be the case in the United States, the effects can be localized. We're talking about an enormous nation. So sometimes there's a sense that it's not happening to me, it's happening to another part of the country, and then maybe there's a sort of more of a sense of disconnection around it. I've heard various explanations. I mean, I've had American colleagues tell me that, there's a lot of sort of belief, nature and the elements are perceived as almost something to battle with, and this is not seen as something new, that this is happening. But I think a lot of it comes down to politics. I think it has been politicized as an issue, just like something like migration has. So I think a lot of people, as with so many sort of political or social issues, are in their little bubbles, in their echo chambers, in terms of what this issue represents. Because if you look at the idea of culpability, I mean, the 10 markets we've looked at, 5 of them are in the world's top 10 polluters, 8 of them are in the world's top 20 polluters. If you look at the United Nations disaster reporting data, obviously countries like India and especially the United States are really at the brunt of natural disasters, a lot of those caused by climate change. So yes, sometimes it can be surprising you don't get the level of engagement you would expect.
Yeah. I mean, that's why I was just thinking that. I was obviously living in the United States. I mean, it feels like we have a major sort of weather event like on a weekly basis. And yet obviously growing up in the UK where things sort of seem to happen pretty, it was pretty infrequent. And so to, that distinction between, Europe and the US and the rest of the world is kind of almost like it's surprising given that what we're talking about with that sort of tangibility of what you see on the ground.
Because even with a country like America, a country like America is obviously relatively independent in terms of not being that dependent on imports and things like that, particularly when it comes to food. They're still being impacted. We're still seeing huge amounts of sort of crop failure, still seeing huge amounts of, uninsured damage happening. Lots of, these very worrying figures coming out of the United States about the millions of homes which are soon going to be uninsurable because of flooding, because of forest fires, and because of other environmental issues as well. So yeah, it is a time bomb. I mean, it's not waiting to happen. It's already hitting. Yeah.
It's interesting. Like obviously, the general assumption is that younger consumers are the most engaged. Is that true from a global perspective? How does it play out?
Most engaged, yes, not most active. I think, we ask people about whether they listen to activists, whether they've been on a climate demonstration. Young consumers would come out very high on that. If you look at, say, a 16 to 24 age bracket. But vegetarianism as well, they score higher on that. But you're still only talking about 6% of that group identify as vegetarian. So What's notable, though, is when we look at the political issues about whether it's climate denial, whether we look at political issues about whether it's voting for the party you think is going to act the most on the environment, their responses are just fairly standard. And actually, when it comes to activities and behaviours, sometimes they're sort of below average. And actually, one thing that's come out of the research is actually probably one of the older cohorts we look at, like the over 55s. If I was a marketeer, I'd be looking at that group because they show the strongest levels of belief in climate change, and they show the strongest levels of belief they can make an impact. And I think the reasons for that are obviously that they're older, they've got that perspective, on seeing what's changed in the world, which is why they buy into this as an idea. And in that time, they've accumulated lots of financial assets, lots of other assets like property, vehicles, financial savings. So that's probably why they feel so impactful. And when we look at levels of behavior, whether it's recycling or reducing clothes consumption or things like that, they are very, very high on that, probably one of the highest groups. So yeah, there's a bit of myth busting going on when we start to look into the demographics of the behavior.
That's interesting. Which countries are you specifically referring to when you think about over 55s?
It's across the board we're seeing this. I mean, there are, there's some markets like Japan where there's a very sort of powerful view of only the government can really have an impact on this. It is systemic. We can't change things as consumers. So we get a lot of modest responses in a country like Japan. But elsewhere, I mean, this bias towards the older consumers being more engaged, more active, it's really across the board.
Yeah. I mean, so taking the perspective of a brand, I'm thinking from a marketing perspective, how should brands think about skepticism and indifference? Is it something they should factor into the equation?
Very much so. I mean, sometimes I speak to brands who think this isn't a consumer-led issue, and I would agree with that. It's not a consumer-led issue. They're having to act because of compliance and regulations. They're having to act because their supply chains are disappearing unless they don't become more sustainable. But when it comes to challenging this consumer skepticism, I mean, this is something that's come about because people are listening to activists more. They are seeing advertising standards authorities call out brands for greenwashing, and we are seeing big proportions of people saying, they don't trust corporate claims around sustainability. I mean, in a country like Germany, it's getting towards half the survey don't trust them. So I think what we talk about a lot in the report, firstly, to sort of counter greenwashing, is we have research where we've asked people, what kind of information do you want to see in sustainable communications or on PAC? And very clearly, people want a sort of third-party rating system, the kind of thing we see in Europe with the Nutri-Score labeling, where you get a color-coded graphic to sort of explain the impact or the health of a product in that case. That's something people are looking for. Something else they're looking for is definitely a sense of the impact positive this has had on people. So I think it's a good idea not just to sort of isolate sustainability as a purely environmental issue. When we look at United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, of course, it's a mix of social goals and environmental goals. And consumers are telling us they definitely want to see what the benefit is for people. So I think we can dig into this a bit more detail later on, but definitely there's a need to sort of maybe embrace this trend of green hushing a little bit because of the cynicism about companies' efforts. It makes sense to soft pedal that in a way. You've got to do it for the issues I talked about earlier, but soft pedal it and maybe focus more on health benefits or benefits to people or economic benefits. We talked about people looking for efficiency very much.
That's interesting. I mean, one thing I remember, obviously we've spoken about, I think you sort of coined this phrase, the say-do gap, I don't know, last year, maybe the year before, but we talked about it, and there's this gap between what consumers say they will do when it comes to sustainability and what they actually do. How big is that gap, and has it widened this year?
Well, yes, this is the value action gap, as it is known in the sustainability community. It is pretty big. It's not really widening, but it's not closing at the same time. And the way we look at it from the perspective of doing consumer research is it's the difference between giving someone a very easy to say yes to statement. So I think we we put a statement in the survey, something like, do you try to live in a way which doesn't impact on the environment? And you'll get something like 85% of people saying, oh, of course, yes. But then if you ask them about their actual behaviors, the most perfunctory thing like recycling, it drops down to about 62%. So you've got an 18-point gap between just this easy to answer statement about, yes, this is an important issue for me, and then a massive drop down to the most perfunctory of behaviors. And then if you look at things like the proportions of people who say they vote for the political party they think is going to have, do the most on climate change, again, you're getting a drop way below that. To, maybe a soft majority of people might answer to that. So it's not being closed at the moment. I guess closing that is the whole ethos of what we're trying to do with this research. So I think in terms of how we can close it, well, one of the early things I mentioned is this abdication of responsibility. People have to face up to the fact that they, as consumers, and the country where they live, is part of this problem. That realization needs to come first. I think in terms of closing it, I mentioned earlier one of the bad news stories from the year was that people feel their impact. They don't feel they can have a strong impact, or they feel they're running out of time. So it's down to governments and it's down to companies to educate a bit on where people can impact. Is it by, getting products which are sourced responsibly, or is it about things which can be recycled, minimum impact? It's down to them to educate people on where they can have an impact and where that happens. Labeling and communications we talked about earlier. There's also need to give people a sense they're part of a momentum. If people are going to need to feel, okay, and this is pertinent to someone like China with its 5-year plans, or pertinent with America, the Inflation Reduction Act. There are huge things happening there in terms of job creation, huge progress being made, and in the European Union in terms of transitioning to renewable energy. So people need to feel that they're part of that movement and to feel they're part of momentum. I think, that's a big challenge as well. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a need really to, if people aren't going to buy into the sustainability credentials, then push the health benefits of those products, push the efficiency benefits or the human benefits they bring as well.
Right. Yeah. I guess, we all have the best of intentions, don't we? And in all aspects of our lives. And you could see that people might intend or think or plan to do something, but actually then falls short. And like you say, sort of education and reminding, it goes back to that tangibility as well, doesn't it? Sort of seeing these, the impact of climate change, head on is obviously something that reminds you that it's a continuous continuous threat. For those consumers that do engage on the issue then, that are, working to close that say-do gap, what are some of the behaviours that are gaining traction, and why are they gaining traction?
Well, the top behaviour, as I mentioned earlier, is recycling, purely because of its convenience. But there is concern about that. We're actually seeing the sort of numbers drop away a little on that.
Really?
Which is concerning, because obviously we have so much news in the media, particularly here in Europe, about the amount of waste which is meant to be recycled, which is then being exported abroad. So there's possibly a bit of a crisis of confidence in that. But elsewhere, it's very clear the leading behaviours, and there's some good insights that come from that, because the leading behaviours are, from a sort of sustainability analyst point of view, they are pure sustainability. They're about being more efficient. So what we're seeing people do is reducing the amount of clothes they buy. We're seeing people, that's, something which you're seeing sort of, anything from 40 to 50% of people doing that. We're seeing anything from 30 to 40% of people reducing the energy they use in cooking, for example. We're seeing around a third of consumers use refill products as well. So it's really about, sustainability professionals would talk about efficiency being another word for sustainability, and unless a behavior or an innovation is about mitigation or dematerialization or longevity or doesn't really count. So it's good to see consumers doing that. They're it's funny saying this for Mintel, because we're always talking about trying to champion consumption for lots of our clients, but reduce consumption, whether it's energy, whether it's how much you're buying, is really the strongest behavior. And it goes back to the thing we talked about with the cost of living crisis, and I think people want a return on investment for their sustainable action. And I think that's fair enough, because that's what consumer-facing businesses are being sustainable. They're doing it to be more efficient and save money. And consumers doing the same. There's a very famous example.
The economics, yeah.
Yeah, there's a famous example from the United States by this flooring company called Interface, who used this natural step framework to reduce their wastage, and they invested in lots of technology, which was smart technology, which only worked when it needed to. They removed glue from their tiles, they start using plant-based materials, and they saved themselves a fortune in landfill taxes and things like that, and they massively reduced their energy usage, massively reduced their emissions in the process. And I know any sustainability heads and companies listening to this will know that story. And it's interesting to me that that's exactly how consumers think about this issue as well. So, and businesses need to recognize that. They want the benefits passing on to them in terms of more efficient behavior.
Yeah, I was fascinated by that. So you're saying that consumers are buying fewer clothes in order to to help impact on with a sustainability motivation. Is that?
No, I don't think it is sustainability motivation, but it's that they're doing it. It might be dressed up as that or championed by brands. They're doing it to save money, and they recognize they've got enough. Right. I mean, we see a lot of campaigns out there shaming people around that. There's Vinted, a clothing reseller in Europe, which has a campaign where they show people walking around with 8 hats on their heads and things like that, and sort of ridiculing it, and saying you've got all this stuff in your wardrobe, which is a financial asset. So we see a lot of companies doing that, leveraging the common sense aspects, the money saving aspects of what is at the same time more sustainable behavior. So it's about not wasting resources. So if you've got all that stuff, sell it. And a lot of financial services brands are doing that as well. There's a lot of apps out there which are sort of incentivizing people, rewarding people for making greener choices or choosing greener behaviors, but also prominently highlighting the financial savings they're making first and foremost. And the sustainable element is kind of the icing on the cake, if you like.
One of the points you make in the report is, and you've made a number of times in our conversation today, is that about putting personal health first. And there's this growing awareness that personal health, environmental health, and mental health are all part of a broader definition of wellness. Of course, I have to bring this back to credit cards. And here in the US, Wells Fargo recently launched a new credit card that was all around self-care and all around well-being. And so they were giving basically extra cash back on 3 areas. One was self-care, which is like gyms and spas. One was recreation. But there was this third bucket called impactful or planet-friendly purchases, and that included riding on public transport, so extra cash back if you pay with a credit card for riding on public transport, charging your EV, but also shopping at thrift stores. So that was particularly interesting because it was very unique. It goes back to what you were saying earlier about people buying less clothing and thinking about different ways of approaching sustainability. Where else have you seen brands innovate at this intersection of health and sustainability, and how do you think that trend will evolve?
Well, it's going to continue going. I mean, if we look at the results in our report, you got about 20% of our sample have got some kind of solar power. Over, I think 51% of our sample have got air conditioning. So that tells you everything you need to know. I mean, people are focused on self-preservation. And some other interesting stuff we see in the research is we ask people, whether they think reducing meat and dairy consumption is something which can be good for the environment. And, maybe sort of 10% of people will agree with that. You've got 20% of people actually doing it. So to me, that infers there's a health benefit. The same goes for renewable energy. More people are investing in renewable energy in their homes and think it's something which is positive for the environment. So the value things are definitely there. The health opportunities are there as well. I mean, definitely plant-based diets. We know if you've got a plant-based diet, your sort of impact is going to be something like 75% lower than someone who's got a sort of meat-based diet. And hall of shame here, in America, 127 kilograms of meat consumed a year on average. That's 10 times the recommendation from the Lancet. But then here in Europe, it's about 75, so I'm not crowing too much.
Oh my goodness.
But yeah, there's an opportunity for plant-based diets to push the nutritional credentials of that. You see brands like Liquid Death who've been, very, very sort of soft-played the sort of benefits of having aluminium cans for an environmental label. They're sort of, competing with soda brands on health grounds very aggressively. But we mustn't assume that less environmentally impactful foods are going to win that health and nutrition battle. It's been a sort of wonderfully savage satirical campaign by America's dairy companies where they created this fake dairy alternative called wood milk. a couple of years ago, and that really kind of showcases the problems, because they basically use it to ridicule dairy alternatives and then highlight their nutritional deficiencies. And of course, a lot of meat alternatives, a lot of dairy alternatives, they're going to fall into categories of ultra-processed foods as well, which we know are linked to obesity, cancer, dementia. So there's a battle to be had here. Now, there's some sustainable behaviors like cycling, which, very straightforward. That's better for you. That's better for the environment than being on public transport or driving. But plant-based diets, basically are healthier as long as they don't stray into that UPF territory. So I think that's where you're going to see it push. You're going to see plant-based diets pushed as being sort of pure and avoiding UPFs. You're going to see them pushed as being something which can help with longevity as well. We've seen that with the blue zones phenomenon. One of the things they focus on, the commonalities between those parts of the world where people are living into past 100 is heavily plant-based diets. That's one of the factors. So yeah, there's a health battle going to be fought between the more sustainable brands and the traditional brands.
That's very, very interesting. All right, so as we start sort of wrapping this up, what would you say is your key message for brands from this year's report?
My key message would be people are becoming more engaged on this issue. They definitely care about it, but they're more cynical about what you as brands do. So I think to win people over, we need those kind of clear metrics which avoid greenwashing. But I think you really need to, as I say, provide the benefits of sustainability which you as a company are looking for by your transition to becoming more responsible. So consumers want to buy into things which are going to help with their health, with self-preservation. They want to buy into things which are going to be efficient and reduce their energy consumption, reduce their wastage. And they also want to buy into things which they see have a human benefit as well. It's not just about having an impact the other side of the world on some ecosystem you know nothing about, even though we are all connected to that before we go down that alley. But, they want to see the human benefit. So humanize the climate crisis and humanize the solutions you're proffering, I think, is definitely one of the key messages of the report.
Okay. Well, with obviously, we're obviously heading into next year. Like, how are you feeling about the year ahead? What are you looking out for?
I'm feeling positive. If you look at the big stories in terms of emissions, there are some positives out there. There's a strong body of opinion that China has reached peak emissions. And you are seeing some really encouraging news around the transition towards renewable energy. There's some really impressive things happening in terms of solar additions, heat pump additions, EV additions. So they do need to grow to sort of stay on the trajectory. So I'm optimistic about that. I think it's good we're getting towards more regulation to stop brands from greenwashing. And we are seeing a lot of sort of steps on that. So that's going to force them to be more real on that. People listening to activists, that encourages me as well. People are getting more clued up on this issue. There are, of course, some big milestones coming. We've got the next COP event, which another controversial venue this year. That's going to be in Azerbaijan as well. So obviously there'll be a lot of things coming out in November. Hopefully we can get governments actually stepping up their commitments in a real sense, so that people like Climate Action Tracker can report on genuine progress, bringing things down closer to a 1.5 target, which we're already at, by the way, for 12 consecutive months. Then we've got, I think, the big thing looming on the horizon. We know half the world's going to the polls this year is the US election, of course. So I've obviously got my eye on that and whether we're going to see people America backtracking on its very impressive commitments it's made recently as a result of that. So everyone's going to have an eye on that.
Yes, for sure. We didn't touch on elections and politics too much in this episode, but as usual, we just scratched the surface today. What are some of the other topics covered in the report, and how can listeners get access to it?
Well, we've talked a lot about, I think, the sort of fast-paced consumer goods side of things. There's a lot of data in the report on, consumer data on electric vehicles, home energy, people's political attitudes and things like that, the kind of innovations they want to see companies making. We've also got a lot of market data in the report as well from our GMPD database, looking at trends in launches. And we've also cut the data as well to get more specific key food and drink, key household, key beauty and personal care consumers as well. And there's a wealth of information there as well. We try and contextualize all of this with what is happening in the world in terms of the progress we're making towards a clean energy system, or, the worsening climatic or disaster situation as well. And we try and inspire and lighten the mood finally, where there's a lot of inspirational innovations in there, a lot of funny and inspirational campaigns you've seen, and a lot of examples from art and popular culture about how they're dealing with this issue as well. And we're taking it out on the road now presenting this to our clients and at various conferences and things as well. So hopefully we can see some of our listeners at one of those events soon.
Excellent. I'm sure we'll provide various links in our show notes. Well, consumers are both part of the problem and the solution, highlighting the power of individual choices in driving meaningful change. Brands, despite facing climate skepticism, must continue to lead with proactive measures. And one way they can do that is with a health-first approach. It's fascinating work. It's a great report. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, everyone, for listening. The conversation doesn't end here. Head over to Mintel's LinkedIn and Instagram and let us know what you think. We'd love to hear your thoughts. If you want to know more about Mintel, visit mintel.com and sign up to become a member of the free Mintel Spotlight community. Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Goodbye for now, and we'll catch you next time for a new episode of Little Conversation.